Today I'm going to talk about exposure for video, and it's not too dissimilar when you're doing exposure for photography, but there are some boundaries and limitations and some side effects and some additional things you need to consider when you're doing exposure for videos. So also I'm going to assume that you're already going to be familiar with some of the terminology I'm going to be using. Hopefully I use the jargon correctly, but that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Exposure is generally referred to in three terms, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. And we have those same things in videos. So let's just make a note of those. So we have shutter speed, we have ISO, we have aperture. But we have one more thing in video we need to consider, and that's the frames per second. And we'll come back to the frames per second, but let's look at shutter speed. We have some limitations on the shutter speeds we can use. And for our Olympus cameras, and most cameras in general, the minimum shutter speed or maximum we can use is 1/24th of a second. That's the slowest shutter speed that we can use. Now the fastest shutter speed we can use is typically 1/8000th of a second. I think the M10 Mark II might be 1/4000th of a second, but for this demo it doesn't really matter. We'll just use 1/8000th of a second. Also on our Olympus cameras, our maximum ISO is limited to 6400 and the minimum ISO is 200. So that's our range there. And then for aperture, that's no different than in photography. It's just limited by your lens. So I'm going to use my 12mm f2.0 as an example. So our maximum aperture is f2 and our minimum aperture is f22. And if we look at these ranges here for each of the shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, it's not bad. I mean, I bet if you looked at like 90% of your photos, all of them probably fall within this range in each column here. So really, what's the problem, right? Well, it's this third thing here, this frames per second. What are the frames per second? And I'll explain what that is. But what's available to us in the camera? Well, we have a 24p, a 25p, a 30p, a 50p, and a 60p. And I think the P in this case just stands for progressive video. But what this is telling us is that when you're recording at 24p, it's recording 24 frames per second. So in a 1 second frame, and let's just draw a little graph here. If this is 1 second of time, it's going to take 24 frames in 1 second. So 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 24. And that's why our shutter speed is limited to 1/24th of a second, because we cannot take, we can't use a shutter speed slower than our frame rate. Because our frame rate, what is this? This is really also, each frame is 1/24th of a second. So that's why the shutter speed is limited to that. Now I'm sure there's cameras that'll do 1/12th of a second or slower. But again, most of us live in this world, right? We have a consumer, prosumer camera. So our shutter speed is going to be limited. Now, you don't want to take a picture though, or I'm sorry, you would never want to take a picture at 1/124th of a second of a person, right? Because it's just not fast enough to really freeze the natural motion that a person is when they're just standing there even. The shot might be slightly blurry, so you like to use a faster shutter speed. So if you can, you might use 1/100th of a second, 1/400th of a second. If they're running, maybe 1/1000th of a second. But you really don't want to do that in video. Because if you take a picture at 1/24th of a second in video, right, the same thing's going to happen. What it does is it takes that picture at 1/24th of a second and puts it into this first frame right here. And then it takes another picture at 1/24th of a second and puts it here. And each one of these are just going to be a little bit blurry, right? Because a photo would be a little bit blurry if it's a picture of a person. So that's why you really don't want to use 1/24th of a second. Now, some people use it creatively to kind of create a surreal effect, you know, where they're like in a dream state. You've seen this in movies where there's like this motion blur, and they accomplish that usually just with, you know, slowing the shutter speed down. But you know, if we just want to take a regular video, we don't want that, right? We want a normal looking video. So why not just use a much faster shutter speed? Like I was saying, we can use 1/100th, 1/400th. Well, the problem with doing that when you're at 1/24th of a second frame rate is each frame is going to be, say, 1/400th of a second. And by the time it gets to the next frame, the person may have moved quite a bit, right, in that 1/24th of a second time frame. And then the camera is going to take another picture at, say, 1/400th of a second shutter speed. And what ends up happening is that the video starts to look a little bit choppy or staccato. And it's really not a big deal if you're not panning or following somebody very quickly. You're probably not going to notice it. And if they're not waving their hands like this, you know, you're not going to notice it. However, it is a very serious challenge for professional work when, for example, when I'm doing my real estate videos and I'm panning the shot of the building, I don't want to deliver a video that's choppy or jittery to the client because I used the wrong shutter speed. So there's a balance though, right? So what is the correct shutter speed? And that's called the 180 rule. And basically all it says is to double your shutter speed versus what your frame rate is. So in this case, you know, if we're at 1/24th, we would use 1/48th of a second. Here we would use 1/50th of a second. Here our shutter speed can be 1/60th, 1/100th, and 1/120. And again, there are cameras that do much faster, and I'm sure there's some that do slower, but for video work, these are the corresponding shutter speeds you want to use for each frame rate. And the most popular one by far is the 24p. And it's not that big a deal to me. I shoot at 30p all the time, and honestly, I can't tell any difference. But for cinematographers, if you remember when the Canon RP came out, there was a big hoopla about how, you know, it didn't have 24p, and everybody made a big deal out of it. You know, because cinematographers, you know, all the movies in the theaters, things like that, they're typically shot at 24p, and I think just our eyes and our psyche are tuned to that frame rate when we go watch a movie, and that gives us that, you know, sort of, yeah, we're seeing a movie and a cinematic movie. So we'll just talk about 24p today. But now that we know basically what our limitations are within the exposure triangle here for video with the corresponding frames per second variable, let's take a typical exposure that we might do in photography and see the challenge that we have when we try to do this in video. Okay, so in, you know, a typical shot might be 1/50th of a second, ISO 200 at f2.0. So this might be a portrait shot because we want the best quality, so we're going to have a low ISO of 200. We want, say, a shallow depth of field, so we're going to shoot at f2.0. And we want to freeze the action as much as we can. So we might shoot at 1/50th of a second. You know, we're not using a flash or anything. So we're going to be at 1/50th of a second. And this is not a bad exposure, right? For photography, we could easily get a shot of someone using these settings. But in video, this is a real challenge. And I'll explain why, because there's something called, you know, from back in the day, the Sunny 16 rule. And what that is it tells us what is the proper settings for the proper exposure in bright daylight. And that rule tells us that the proper exposure on a sunny day is 1/100th of a second, ISO 100 at f/16. Hence the name Sunny 16. Now on our Olympus cameras and in video in particular, we're limited to 200 ISO. Some cameras, their base ISO is 800 in video, but and some are 100, but for us we're at 200. So if we want the equivalent exposure in video using the Sunny 16 rule, we would have an ISO of 200, and I don't want to change the f-stop, we'll just stay at f/16. What would I have to do to the shutter speed to match the previous exposure? I would just have to cut it in half or go to 1/200th of a second. So on a bright sunny day, the proper exposure for video would be 1/200th of a second, ISO 200, f/16. And you can see we're very, very far away from our target exposure of 1/50th, ISO 200, f2. So how far away are we? All right, let's do the math real quick. Well, this one works out nicely. We're exactly 2 stops off because there's one stop here and there's another stop here. So we're 2 stops off. 1/200th cuts in half to 1/100th, and that cuts down to 1, or doubles to 1/50th of a second. Our ISO, unfortunately, is fixed at 200. We cannot go any lower to achieve the correct exposure. And for our f-stop, to go from f/16 to f2, how many stops away are we? Well, if we count this out, what's the next one? 11, f11, f8, f5.6, f4, f2.8, and finally we're back to f2.0. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stops difference from f2 to f/16. And if we add these two together, right, we are 8 stops away from our target exposure of 1/50th of a second, ISO 200, f2.0, right? We're really far away from this by 8 stops. So how do we get to that in video? Well, this is why the 8-stop ND filter is a very popular filter. If you go online and shop for ND filters, there'll always be a list of ND8s, you know, really good selection of those, because this is a very, very popular ND filter, because this is what gets us back to this. It lets the videographer go from 1/200th of a second, f/16, down to 1/50th of a second, f2.0, by putting this filter on. And it's always something a cinematographer will have in their toolkit or in their bag, always. The other challenge we have in video is the 1/24th of a second shutter speed, which is really not really a shutter speed we would use. Again, 1/50th of a second is our challenge when we're in low light. And that's why the market for video lights is also huge for cinematographers, right? You know, I was promoting this light here a couple of weeks ago for video. I was using it for photography, but these lights and big lights, I'm using like 400 watts of lights here for my studio, and I'm still at like ISO 400 at f2.8 with my EM1 that I'm recording here. It takes a lot of light to get us back to 1/50th of a second when we're in a low light situation. And so those are always the two things cinematographers have, are ND filters and video lights, right? And lots of lights in particular. So what do I recommend you do, right? If you don't have an ND filter and you don't have, tons of video light, well, really, the best thing to do is just to shoot an aperture priority. Okay, and when you do that on your camera, at least on our Olympus cameras, you can set the aperture, say, to f2. Maybe that's the desired aperture you want. I'm shooting at f2.8 because I don't want the depth to feel too shallow, right? But it's better to have the control over the depth of field than really any of the other settings. Because when you're in aperture priority, the camera is going to be in auto ISO between 200 and 6400, and it's going to control the shutter speed between 1/24th of a second and 1/8000th of a second, or 1/4000th. And if you're in good light, generally you're always going to be in ISO 200 anyway. Outdoors, ISO 200, and your shutter speed's going to be probably the 1/100th, 1/200th anyway. And that's not too bad. As long as you get to choose the aperture and you have that creative effect. Because even though your shutter speed is going to be too fast, and it's not going to be in that 180 rule, you're really not going to notice in your videos. I mean, I shoot aperture priority all the time for my videos when I'm out doing my vlogs. If I'm out shooting at night, my shutter speed does go down probably to 1/24th, and my ISO probably goes all the way up to 6400 ISO. But in practice, I found that it doesn't really make that much difference for just, the average person, right? Your video is going to come out great. And as long as you're not panning too much and you're not trying to record, some really fast sports actions or birds in flight, those kind of things, the video is going to look good. And it really, you're not going to notice that staccato effect when you're watching it, because it kind of brings me back to, again, what's the most important thing in your video or in your photography? It's telling the story. And that's what your video should be doing, is telling that story or capturing that moment, right? Those important times in your life or important people in your life. And things like shutter speed and ISO are not going to mean anything when you're recording those. Now, if you're going to be doing professional work or you want to take your video to the next level, then yeah, you're definitely going to need to get one of these 8-stop ND filters or higher. They have 16-stop ND filters. They get kind of expensive, and you're definitely going to need some video lights.